The Last of Us Part 2 dropped like a bomb. The game was so controversial that it led to one of the most toxic and divisive discourse cycles in the history of video games, splitting the fan base of one of the most universally beloved pieces of media cleanly in two. There were the leaks, which were monumental in shaping its pre-launch reception, followed by some, let's just say, less than pleased people when it eventually released back in 2020. You have an opinion about The Last of Us Part 2. I know you do, otherwise you wouldn't have clicked on this video. You might love it, praising its complex structure, its risky narrative choices, and its ability to serve as one of the biggest emotional gut punches in any piece of media. You might hate it. Perhaps you couldn't get on board with Naughty Dog's controversial choices. Maybe you just really hate golf, I don't know. Regardless, The Last of Us Part 2 has left a lasting impact on the industry, and its release has been a story shrouded in conflict. We all remember the review bombing, the vitriol, with some absolute idiots going so far as to threaten Laura Bailey, the voice actress for Abby, and her family in some unhinged attempt at getting back at the developers for the decision to kill off Joel in the opening hours of the game. I found this whole ordeal to be rather frustrating, to see so much division and toxicity over a game that I found to be some of Naughty Dog's best work. I love The Last of Us Part 2 for what it reaches for, genuinely trying to push the medium forward through its structure and unconventional narrative. It was risky, something that is becoming increasingly uncommon in the AAA space. As budgets balloon ever upwards and corporations become ever more risk-averse, to see that very ambition turned around to bludgeon the people that worked so hard to bring the game to life. It just didn't make sense to me. I made a video a couple of months ago talking about how Season 2 of HBO's The Last of Us really failed to capture the essence of The Last of Us Part 2, how it fundamentally misunderstood its source material and came out all the worse for it. In that video, I was what I would describe as very charitable to those that view The Last of Us Part 2 negatively, making a genuine effort to try and unpack just what it was that Craig Mazin was trying to address for the game's biggest critics. And still, I got comments saying that I was misdiagnosing just why people didn't like The Last of Us Part 2, and that I just don't understand that the game's writing is actually just terrible, and that's why the show was bad. I made that video because I really wanted people to see that the HBO project was bad on its own merit, that it feels the way that it does because it fundamentally doesn't understand or even attempt to tell the story that it's based on. I was charitable to the anti-Last of Us 2 viewpoint in that video, so much so that my actual view may have been somewhat unclear. I think that people that endlessly hate on The Last of Us Part 2 are wrong. I think that the discourse is so full of meaningless nitpicks, fundamental misunderstandings of narrative design, and just some really, really bad takes. I want to set in stone what I think on the matter. So, this video is a defense of what I believe to be one of the most ambitious and thought-provoking video games of all time. Because The Last of Us Part 2 is good, actually. The Last of Us was a story fundamentally about love. It was a story of two people brought together through pure circumstance, eventually forming an inseparable bond. It was about Joel and Ellie becoming Joel and Ellie, and the lengths that people will go to protect those that they care about. It's really easy to forget that the ending of that game was one of the most hotly debated scenarios in video game media around that time. Joel's decision to massacre the Fireflies to stop them using Ellie's brain to create a cure for the cordyceps, essentially dooming the world to save his surrogate daughter. It's a decision that feels both unconscionable and deeply human in the same breath. It's so selfish, but incalculable violence in the name of keeping your loved ones safe is something that we can all at least understand. If The Last of Us is a story about the lengths we'll go to, the things we will do to protect those that we care for, then The Last of Us Part 2 is about consequences. I have seen many a person complain online about the game's messaging, that the plot can be distilled simply to revenge and violence are bad, a ham-fisted moral declaration that exists as nothing more than to prove some superiority on the writer's part. I've seen people say that the story is disrespectful to real fans of the series, whatever that means, and I've seen people call The Last of Us Part 2 the worst game ever made. I do find it incredibly interesting that the game garnered such a vitriolic response, considering that it's a cautionary tale in and of itself. It is fundamentally a story about how our grief can cause immeasurable damage to those around us, and it's about making a conscious effort despite our biases to find empathy for those we might initially think undeserving. And I think it's fair to say that the people that were the loudest in their disdain for the game, the fact that their expectations were shattered and The Last of Us Part 2 was not the game they wanted, that can almost be interpreted as a type of grief in itself. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those that did the most damage in the post-release firestorm were probably also those that felt the strongest about what the game should have been in their eyes. Look, I don't want to do the whole life imitates art thing, but for the themes of the narrative to almost perfectly map onto the discourse, at a macro level, it's at the very least interesting and something I think we should think about going forward. When I think about games that elicit an emotional response, The Last of Us Part 2 is right up there on the list. Look, there were obviously plenty of games before that point that managed to knock you on your ass, but I can't quite remember a game that hit quite as hard and quite as often as The Last of Us Part 2, which is especially interesting considering the first game introduced a lot of people to just how emotionally resonant video game stories can be. We travelled across the United States with Joel and Ellie in search of the Fireflies and saw them grow and change as they pushed through hell to potentially find a cure for the cordyceps brain infection. Joel and Ellie forged a bond that was so strong that when Joel is mercilessly beaten to death by an unknown assailant, Jesus, that escalated quickly, you can't help but fall into a cocktail mix of anger, regret, and immense grief. It's that connection that you share with Joel as the player from the first game that makes that event so powerful. I remember feeling my blood boil in that moment, the rage and the emptiness that came after. The indignation I felt. To me, it was the perfect inciting incident for what would be the story of The Last of Us Part 2. But this decision has also been one of the game's most controversial. A fundamental pillar of the narrative is to rile you up enough that you're going to be willing to follow Ellie to the ends of the earth for justice. Abby committed an unspeakable atrocity, and for that, she has to pay. How could she not? Joel's death was one of the most horrific things I have witnessed in any piece of media. It was so unspeakably cruel, an absolute kick in the stomach. And to a lot of people, I think that feeling might have been too much to bear, and fair enough. But the thing that it does almost without fail is instill this absolute hatred of the culprit within you to the point where you're willing to do practically anything in the fight for at least what you'll perceive as justice. The ending of the first game is important here, because I think that it's very difficult to argue that Joel's decision to murder an entire hospital's worth of people that were by definition trying to do the right thing for humanity isn't at the very least bad. Whether or not the decision makes sense, or if you would do the same if put in that situation, the actual violence committed in and of itself is bad. Now, people can do bad things for reasons that might feel right to them, and you can even make a pretty strong argument that at least to that person, their action was justified, but the point remains the same. Joel did a bad thing, but you get it. In fact, there's such a high likelihood that you get it that you're willing to forget all of the questionable moral implications of it in search of vengeance. That is the fundamental underpinning of this narrative setup. Abby and the Salt Lake crew, they have to be irredeemable in your mind. You have to hate them in order to have the motivation to follow Ellie through what will become an increasingly reprehensible excursion through the rainy city of Seattle. If you've read any discussion around The Last of Us Part 2, there's no doubt that you've run into one of the most pervasive arguments amongst people that hate the game, and that is that Joel, in following Abby back to the lodge in the game's opening and being friendly with her group, is somehow acting in a way that is absolutely preposterous and unbelievable, all because Joel, living a life as a smuggler in Boston, was cold and cautious. I've always found this argument to be one of the weakest from those that dislike this game. People have described it as a plot hole. I've seen people say that it ruins the entire story for them. I've always found this moment where Joel says his name in the basement of the lodge and everyone looks around like they've seen a ghost. I think it's one of the best scenes in the whole story, and the writers were clearly able to communicate something interesting to the audience. Characters aren't static objects. The whole plot of the original game saw Joel evolve from this soulless husk of a man into someone more capable of love and compassion, something that he had clearly suppressed for 2 decades after the outbreak. He was incredibly cold at the start of the game, yes, but slowly opened up to Ellie as he began to recognize her as family. Even in the first game, Joel's arc involved him softening up a little, so you can only imagine what effect a life of relative comfort in Jackson could have on him. So for Joel to save someone's life and not immediately shut down when encountering a group of strangers, these people are absolutely right that it's possible that Joel from the first game probably wouldn't act like that. But what does that tell you? Certainly not that the writing is dog shit, but that the character has changed over time, and no shit, right? People constantly complain about needless exposition, but then when a character is shown to have changed instead of outright stating it, people lose their minds. The difference in behavior tells you so much, and his whole arc from the first game was clearly leading towards this. It's really baffling to me that people take this argument seriously, as it completely ignores the idea that most stories are fundamentally about how characters change over time. I've also seen people argue that this whole sequence is somehow disrespectful towards Joel because people loved him, and yes, they did love the character, but to me, that love for the character is why this interaction is such a powerful inciting incident. The monolith that you once knew is murdered right in front of you, and that is monumental in putting you in Ellie's shoes, ready for the journey ahead as you worked to enact justice on those responsible. One of the biggest risks The Last of Us Part 2 takes is its complex narrative structure, another thing that has been heavily criticized over the years. I've seen people suggest consistently after its release that if the events were just shifted around, or if the story was simply told in a more linear fashion, that it would alleviate a lot of the issues that they had with it. But obviously, as we've seen from the show, that presents at least in a somewhat more chronological fashion, or the game's very own chronological mode, the narrative that Neil Druckmann and Haley Gross wanted to tell is fundamentally linked to its structure. Pacing is almost always a conversation that comes up when discussing the game, as it is perhaps a sticking point for a lot of people. The game, at least in Ellie's chapter, seems to be building momentum consistently, as Ellie partakes in increasingly depraved acts on her quest to hunt down Abby, but when the two finally meet, the game decides to rewind time and replay the events of the Seattle chapter from her perspective instead. At least at the beginning, it does feel like the game comes to a halt at a relatively climactic moment, but I'd argue that the significance of this perspective shift is so important that the game needs to slow down in order to soften the blow of just how jarring this can be. We're thrown into the shoes of a character we've just spent the entire game up to this point trying to kill, but only after discovering her motivations for killing Joel are we made to walk a mile in her shoes. Look, I get why people don't like this, but also, it's kind of entirely the point. You're made to feel incredibly uncomfortable, but it's in that discomfort that the game asks you to do something that video games seldom have the gall to ever attempt, and that is to interrogate your own bias, something that the game was definitely hinting at through Ellie's section. As she becomes increasingly deranged, pushing away those that are trying to help her and even abandoning Tommy to go after Abby, you're made to start questioning whether or not this behavior can ever be worth it, as it becomes increasingly clear that she's out of her depth and unsure of just how far she'll have to go in order to enact revenge on Joel's killer. And just as you're at your most uncertain of a character you were almost perfectly aligned with at the start of the narrative, you're forced to reckon with Abby herself. I've seen people say that the story is nothing more than manipulation on behalf of the writers, trying to trick you into thinking that Abby's actions were okay. I genuinely think that this is just such a perversion of Druckmann's intentions here. Abby has undeniably done some really reprehensible things to characters that you really care about as a player, not just Joel, but Jesse and Tommy as well. Where some people have called out the writing for trying to unscrupulously influence how you feel about Abby, I honestly feel like the story presents her in a relatively balanced manner, showing both the good action she takes in order to try and reconcile for her past behavior, but also genuinely and honestly presenting the more questionable aspects of her personality. She's described on multiple occasions as being highly effective in the war against the Seraphites, even being directly called out for being hypocritical for saving Lev and Yara by Mel, and yeah, she kind of isn't wrong. She also has an affair with Owen, despite Mel being pregnant with his child. The game definitely presents many aspects of Abby's person that aren't all sunshine and rainbows like these people seem to describe. To me, Naughty Dog lay out the full picture of Abby's character, the good and the bad, and allow you to come to your own conclusions about her, which is clearly evident by the divide in people's responses to her. It's using Abby to ask a question. Can you truly understand someone that you hate? And in order to do that, of course you have to switch your brain on and confront your own bias. And here's the thing, you can go through all of that and still think that Abby is a bad person. The major idea, though, is that regardless of how you feel about Abby at that point, you understand why she did what she did, and also why she didn't just kill Dina and Ellie in the theater. Yes, the game is testing you emotionally, and that can be quite challenging for some, but to act like it's just using cheap tricks to manipulate you into loving Abby as a character, I just can't agree with that at all. You don't have to like her, you just have to understand. Out of every controversy, every discussion surrounding the game, perhaps the most pivotal is the final sequence of events in Santa Barbara. Looking at the discourse, more than anything, Ellie's decision to not drown Abby draws a line in the sand that caused a lot of people to completely write off this game's narrative. A revenge story without the revenge. A failure of Naughty Dog to say anything meaningful because Abby does all of this horrible shit and gets to live. Look, I think that the fundamental disconnect here goes back to Joel himself. I've seen people claim that The Last of Us Part 2 retcons everything about Joel's character, portraying him as an evil and calculated murderer that just kills doctors for the sake of it and probably kicks babies as well. And man, I think this couldn't be further from reality. The narrative hinges in its entirety on understanding Joel's decision, and yet possibly even viewing it as morally correct. Druckmann himself has come out and said that he thinks that Joel was right in his decision to take Ellie from the hospital, despite the implication that he would doom the world in doing so. And here's the thing, Joel's decision at the end of the first game was never about whether or not the Fireflies were capable of producing a cure. If you're claiming that, you are just wrong. It's about what is worth sacrificing to you to protect those that you care about. That is why the moral implication behind it is interesting. If you remove that implication and just say that it wouldn't have worked anyway, and the Fireflies were just evil people trying to cut the brain out of a 14-year-old for no reason, all of that discussion and nuance surrounding whether or not Joel did the right thing for him becomes a huge nothing burger. I just find it incredibly ironic that the same people that claim to be the biggest fans of the original render the ending of the first game absolutely meaningless in their desire to prove why Part 2 is terrible. For Part 2's narrative to make sense, it still has to have a fair amount of sympathy and understanding for what Joel did. It completely respects the idea that Joel did a bad thing in massacring the Fireflies to save Ellie, but it also fully leans into that idea that the decision is completely human and something that many of us would do if we were put in the same position. You can't make the argument that the game writes Joel off as being immoral and unjustified and simultaneously use this as the reason that Ellie is able to bring herself back from the edge of depravity. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Ellie's quest for justice, in its purest form, is not even about Abby. It's about the guilt that she has for cutting Joel out of her life, because in her heart of hearts, even she had sympathy for what he did, despite feeling like Joel took the only chance of her life being truly impactful in the world away from her. So when she makes the decision to not drown Abby, she isn't just letting Joel's killer leave, she's freeing herself from that guilt and making the decision to remember Joel for what she loved about him and not the parts that facilitated so much of her rage towards the Salt Lake crew. The Last of Us Part 2 is not about revenge. It never was. It's about moving forward with your life regardless of the hardships that others cause you. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, something that's becoming increasingly relevant with the state of our political discourse at the moment. It's about understanding that the people responsible for creating so much trauma for Ellie had their own lives and complex feelings about the issue and might have even had it coming. But to Abby, were still fundamentally her friends on their own path, just like Joel was, and just like Ellie is. The porch scene cements all of this, showing the last conversation that Joel and Ellie ever had. The pain, the guilt, and ultimately the final chance at reconciliation that Ellie had ripped away from her. It's one of the most tragic moments I think I've ever seen in any piece of media, and I don't think it would work in quite the same way without the context of everything that came before. Ellie could have drowned Abby in the Pacific, but what would that have achieved? Just like Abby was after killing Joel, she'd still be lost, desperately looking for a way to move forward with her life and for a chance to heal. Abby found that chance in Lev, and Ellie found that chance in laying down her arms and walking away. The Last of Us Part 2 is really challenging to talk about. The impact that the game had was undeniable, unfortunately sparking one of the most toxic discourse cycles in video game history, but also telling a story that was incredibly thought-provoking and doing so in a way that was really only possible through the medium itself, asking you as a player to step into the shoes of a character you despise and learn what makes them tick. I am genuinely of the camp that it is one of the most impressive video games ever made, but that's not to say it's without fault. I do think that the Seraphites are probably a bit too ritualistic to suit the messaging of Abby's sections, just to mention one point, but so much of the discourse online has been incredibly sycophantic, as people with intense hatred towards the game and the studio still, 5 years on, complain about it every single day. And let's not forget the harassment that many have received over it, from developers to content creators. The response can only be described as unacceptable. Look, overall, I think that the game tells the story that the studio wanted to tell, and regardless of whether or not that was the story that the real fans wanted, I think it's important to recognize at least how ambitious and risky Part 2 is as a project. It's really impressive, and no amount of internet toxicity can really get in the way of that. From its incredibly dynamic narrative structure and its emotionally heavy writing, The Last of Us Part 2, in my mind at least, will be remembered as one of the best video games ever made, and one of my favorite stories of all time, really reminding us that games have this immense potential for unique and interesting storytelling when developers are willing and able to take risks. The divide on the matter is sad to see for sure, but I think the fact that people on both sides are still talking about it 5 years on is a testament to just how impactful this story was, and a reminder we should probably strive to be a little bit kinder to one another. There's no doubt that the world could use a bit more of that.